Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. I wanted to start today's program with a bit of good news. For those of you that may be regulars at this point, we haven't been on long enough to have regulars, but for those of you who have been regulars and may have seen one of our earlier shows, we did a segment on a local citizen lobbyist group that was trying to resolve some problems in Basalt, Colorado, where people are living in a trailer park, and the trailer park is going to be revised for some other civic improvements, and there's been issues about relocation. Well, in the local paper yesterday, it was reported that an anonymous financial angel has stepped up and is now going to be providing this group with some financial support, as reported, that will help them secure mortgages or other financing so they can find alternative housing. So congratulations on that success, and hopefully this is the kind of good news thing we're trying to promote here, that when you get active and you voice your message and you do it professionally and you do it openly in the right way, good things can happen. So again, congratulations. On our last show, we started our conversation about campaign finance reform. We were talking to Peter Wallison, and on today's show we're going to continue with part 2. And again, for those of you that may not have seen that show, what we started talking about are the problems of campaign finance. And we drilled down a bit and talked about the difference between hard money and soft money. And we hit on a topic called incumbency protection that derives from Peter's book, and I think is a very important notion to focus on. And again, in the last show, we also spent some time walking through some of the elements of incumbency protection. After I was looking at the tapes from the show, I realized, however, that we kind of glossed over some very important issues related to understanding campaign finance reform. And before we get to part 2, I wanted to spend some time talking about those. And particularly, 2 important court decisions that occurred after Peter's book was written, and then kind of a legal maneuvering that has tied some things together that I think has exacerbated the campaign finance situation. And again, I wanted to spend some time to get you caught up on that before we move forward with our discussion. There were 2 very important cases decided in 2010, and I've got them on the board here. One is the Citizens United case, and the other one is the Speech Now case. You may have heard of these because they've really turned the world of campaign finance upside down, and they have really exaggerated the problem to, I think, an uncontrollable scale. In the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court basically decided that corporations and unions can make unlimited expenditures. This is a reversal of long-time law that basically had limited significantly the corporate ability to make contributions, and now has turned that again on its head, and corporations and unions are now essentially allowed to make unlimited expenditures. Now, this is primarily on the soft money side, as we talked about before, but the soft money side is really where all the action is when you add up the expenditure in campaign dollars. The second decision that's really critical to understand is the Speech Now versus FEC decision. And what that decision basically said was that independent expenditure committees can receive unlimited contributions. This is the world of super PACs. You've heard this term, super PACs. Well, PACs were political action committees. They were able to raise money and get involved in, again, on the soft money side. But now we have these so-called super PACs, because the amount of funds that are pouring in is just staggering, beyond anything we've ever seen before. And it played out in the last election cycle with these super PACs just really dominating the airwaves and dominating the media. Finally, however, if you had only those 2 decisions, it still would not have been as problematic as what I think has occurred with the third step here, and that is the people that are setting up super PACs and setting up other organizations to take in these dollars now have started to use nonprofit status to avoid disclosure. And to me, this is probably the most troubling part of all. When it comes to campaign finance, I've always felt that if the Republicans and the Democrats and their supporters and their soft money side is essentially raising the same amount of money and they're kind of killing each other equally, maybe I shouldn't worry or we shouldn't worry. But now we're in an environment where these funds are going to be transacted, these funds are going to be donated and used, and we will not know who is making these contributions. We will not have the type of transparency that I think is essential for politics. And at some point, I think we're going to have to take that on and deal with it. So you got the combination of these 3 elements: Citizens United, Speech Now, and the use of nonprofit status to avoid disclosure. Again, all of these things have occurred since Peter wrote his book, and we just didn't get to them on the last show, so I wanted to make sure we covered them before we moved ahead. Welcome back. We're going to start our second segment today on campaign finance reform. We're again joined by our rock star, Peter Wallison, author of Better Parties, Better Government. And for those of you that joined us during the first segment, what we did is, I don't know if demystify is a little too strong here, but the average person doesn't like campaign finance. They don't like how they think it affects the system. But Peter and his partner, Joel Gora, they've drilled down and they've pushed past this veneer of what the average person may think is the problem with campaign finance reform, and they've taken this to a whole new place. What they're focusing on is the element of competitiveness, how you get better candidates to run for office, and this whole notion of the fact that the campaign finance laws are basically driven to protect the incumbents. And we analyzed on the first show how that happens and why the system has really inured to the benefit of the incumbents. What we promised to talk about today are some of the solution sets, because the book does a really nice job, I think, of drilling down and explaining some available solutions and perhaps how to get there. Maybe a better place to start, though, is to talk about some of the solutions that aren't solutions. Mm-hmm. For instance, people think, well, if we got the money out of it and government just paid for it, or people did this voluntary contribution thing, and we took the bad money and just pushed it back over there, everything could be okay. But I think your book does a nice job of explaining that's probably not going to solve the problem.
No, it will not solve the problem. In fact, it's probably likely to make the problem worse. What we saw with campaign finance reform beginning when it began in 1974 was that, and incidentally, it was originally introduced as a response to what happened in Watergate. Right? It was supposed to really clean up the act in Watergate.
Let's go back to Watergate.
These were part of the Watergate reforms.
Okay.
But what it did was, and this is important for your question, what it did was restrict the amount that candidates could spend on election. There are two parts to the whole campaign finance issue. One is contributions, and the other is expenditures. And what the so-called Watergate reforms, the amendments that were adopted in 1974, did was say candidates can only spend a limited amount on their campaigns.
If they take the public money?
No.
Oh, under any circumstances?
In general,
okay.
They could only spend a certain amount on their campaigns. Now, if you want to think of an incumbent protection provision that is the most powerful, it would be that. Because the only way that a challenger has a chance to defeat an incumbent is by spending money, so he or she becomes known to the voters. Here's the Reform Congress in 1974 trying to reform the finance campaign laws. They provide that one of the restrictions that they're imposing is that no one can spend more than a certain amount on the campaign. Sounds even-handed, of course, because it applies to both candidates and challengers, but when you think about it, you can see what a tremendous benefit it is for incumbents, because they're already known.
Their name recognition is there already.
They already are known. So
the franking privilege you talked about and everything else.
And they have an office in the district, and they have they have staff in Washington that helps them out. All of those things are fine. We wouldn't challenge those things. It's important for the candidate, the incumbent, to have a way to communicate with his or her constituents. So all that's fine. But it does amount to tremendous benefits for incumbents. And what does Congress do the first time it has an opportunity to impose reform? It says you're limited in the amount that you can spend on your campaign. It was a very small amount. I think it was something like $70,000 would be the total amount that anyone can spend on a campaign. Well, fortunately, when that got to the Supreme Court struck it down. They said, look, we can understand limits on contributions because, all right, it might look as though when a candidate is receiving a lot of money from a special interest of some kind, that there's some corruption going on here. So if you're trying to prevent corruption, we can affirm limits on contributions. But limits on expenditures, we can't affirm that. because that would make it very difficult for anyone ever to defeat an incumbent. It's already difficult enough, said the court. To impose a limit on expenditures would be the worst thing that would happen here. So this is one of the reasons why I and many, many other people are very concerned about the government providing the financing for campaigns. Because who is making that law? It's Congress. They are going to make a law that looks on the surface as though it is fair to everybody, but in fact it has to be favorable to incumbents. If they say, for example, well, the government will provide for each candidate $300,000 to run in a congressional district. Fair, right? $300,000 for the government, for the incumbent, $300,000 for the challenger. Well, that's not exactly fair because the incumbent already has tremendous advantages that I outlined before. So, although it has a facial appearance of fairness, it actually turns out to be incumbent protection. So the whole idea that government might provide the financing is on its face favorable to incumbents. And then there's the First Amendment question. And in the first segment here, we talked about the fact that the real purpose of the First Amendment, it's important for a lot of things, but the real fundamental purpose that the founders must have had in mind was the voters should get as much information as they can possibly get before the elections. The incumbents don't want that, but that's what the founding fathers seem to want. And so if we are really observing the policy that is underlying the First Amendment to our Constitution, we would make sure that as much money can be spent on campaigns as is necessary, as seen by the people involved in the campaigns, to achieve office.
Don't you have another problem with these government finance options with some of these incredibly wealthy candidates that are coming on board now, and they have the right to spend their own resources, correct? You can't limit a person's willingness to spend money on their own resources.
That was another, I'm glad you raised that because this is a beautiful little story. That was another one of the restrictions in 1974 that Congress put in, and that is that no person could spend more than $70,000 on his own election. Now, if the whole objective here was to prevent corruption, why can't a person spend as much as he wants on his own election since he can't corrupt himself? You ought to allow him to spend as much as he wants. Of course, the Supreme Court saw it the same way and struck it down. But in 2002, when there were further amendments to the original campaign finance law, Congress introduced something called the millionaire provision. In the millionaire provision, if an incumbent is facing a candidate who can spend $350,000 of his own money on the campaign, the incumbent then is relieved of many of the restrictions on the size of the contributions he can receive or she can receive.
Another incumbency protection.
Right. It's so obviously an incumbent protection provision. It's really quite striking that they would even do it, that they had the nerve to do it. But it just shows what this is all about. This is all about protecting incumbents. And so we go back to this question of government financing. No way, because what will happen to the American people is that the amount of information they will get will be limited because incumbents don't want them to get as much information as possible. That's against their interests.
So what you're really trying to get at, I think, in your book here is you're trying to break this cycle of incumbency protection. And one way you see to do that is to re-empower the party.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people might not like that. Some people already think the parties are empowered too much, and giving them this additional power is not the way to go.
Right.
So how do you respond to that?
Well, I think that is a really legitimate question and one that we have to wrestle with a bit. There are several sides to this question. I believe in competition. I believe in competition in the private sector. I believe in the market system for exactly that reason. I think it lowers prices, it creates innovation, all kinds of things like that when people compete. So if it works in the market system, it also would work in politics. We want the most competition we can possibly get. And that's why I have been looking for a way of financing challengers to incumbents. And the only way that seems to be fair and reasonable is to allow the parties, the political parties, to finance their candidates in a way that they cannot. Under the first section, when we talked first, I pointed out that by statute, the political parties cannot finance their candidates except to a very limited degree. And it turns out that for House and Senate races, that direct financing from the party to the candidate amounts to about 1% of the total cost of running a campaign. So the parties are already very severely limited in what they can provide. So how would we make campaigns more competitive? We could enable the parties to provide the financing. Now, what that will do is to make parties more powerful. And if people are afraid of political parties, that's something to consider. The parties will be more powerful. But would the parties impose very strict philosophical or ideological positions on their candidates? My view of that is no. What the parties want to do is to get a majority in Congress, a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate. And how do you do that? You have to put forth a candidate who has a philosophical view that fits with the district he or she is running in. So the inclinations of the parties will be to find candidates who are in the middle, because we know that the best chance you have of winning in almost any constituency, not all, of course, but in almost any, is to get the broad middle and take the people who will vote for the party's candidate under any circumstances, but then pick up the independents in the middle between left and right. And so the likelihood is when the parties are financing candidates, they will have a lot of power, but they won't have the power to impose a strict ideological position on their candidates, because they know the result of that will be that they will lose more elections in the future.
I think I agree with you on the general election side, but how do you think this plays out in the primary election? You think the parties just stay out of the primaries, or do they kind of pick the horse they want in the primary now, knowing that they're going to ride that horse all the way through the general?
I think that will work this way, and we don't know exactly, but it probably will work this way, and that is that the parties will have a favorite candidate in the district. They will have the candidate they think will win. Now, they will probably not, under the laws that we are proposing, be able to finance that candidate. That candidate will have to stand on his feet, or her feet, for the primary to fight it out.
So you'd have a dichotomy almost. This set of rules you're proposing would be for the general election.
Only for the general.
Okay,
that's right.
I don't know if I missed that in the book, or you didn't emphasize it, or
it's in there.
I missed it.
Well, no, we wanted to be sure that people understood that we weren't talking about the party selecting the candidates, but the party would make clear in the district who they think would be the candidate they would like to have representing the party in that district. And that would be a big leg up for that particular candidate. So I think that's the kind of balance we'd like to achieve. We don't want the parties to have so much power as to be able to select the person who runs in a particular district, but we want them to be able to say to the people in the district, if you want this candidate to win, if you want a candidate from our party to win in this district, you should support this person because we think he would be the best candidate. If another candidate wins, we can't guarantee that we're going to be willing to finance that campaign. We may use our funds where it would be more effective in other districts. So that's the kind of balance that we have to reach. It's a difficult balance, but it does prevent the parties from becoming too powerful. If the parties become so powerful that they can attain control over the candidates completely, then I think that would be a negative.
Well, I think, as you said, if you differentiate the primary from the general, that might do it for you. What I like about what you're doing here and proposing, and you've talked about it again, is the things that are broken in the system. Part of them comes down to the fact that because of incumbency protection, we have too many congressional seats where there is no competition at all. Right. In fact, we had a guest on an earlier show who said that in the next election, they're predicting there could be as few as 30 contested congressional seats. So it's
Mhm.
30 contested seats out of 400 some.
Right.
That's not appropriate.
That's right.
And the other thing I think I agree with you on entirely, if you have your system in place, the discussion is going to head towards the middle. Because if you have these districts now that are skewed towards one side or the other, and the other party can in fact now finance and put up a candidate, by definition, the dialogue has to get to the center.
Yes, sir.
And I think that's really what's missing here. The two prongs of this program are to talk about dysfunction and understand polarization, and it's the polarization that also is being attacked by some of your concepts here. So let's say you're right, and I like where you're going here. How do you get this done? I mean, how do you get these incumbents that have been protecting themselves to change the law in Washington to unprotect themselves?
That's very hard. But I will say that
sell more books.
There was a lot of opposition to both the 1974 amendments that protected the incumbents and what was called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002. This was the McCain-Feingold Act in 2002, which was also another incumbent protection act. The fact it was bipartisan should tell you a lot. But there was opposition. There was pretty strong opposition to both of those. Just wasn't enough to defeat the laws in Congress. So it's a matter really of the public understanding this issue more than they have in the past, and saying, now I understand why we have this situation we have. I do not like what I see when I see candidates going to special interests and getting money from them. I don't like that. I don't like the fact that really good people will not stand for office because they don't want to have to grub for money among their friends. I don't like the fact that the special interests are the only ones who can really provide money to the candidates, and that they are protected because the incumbents have so many advantages over the challengers. I don't like all those things about the campaign finance law now. I think we ought to have a situation in which the political parties are able at least to raise the money and finance their candidates. That would look better to me. And it's not the easiest thing in the world for people to understand against all the other things that are being presented to them. But if one of the ways they think this can be solved is by having the government provide the money, I think I've provided the reasons why the government doing it would not actually help at all. In fact, it'll make things worse. So we have a whole series of possible ways that we might go. But the current system is not working well. It's dividing our politics in a very bad way. And it's incumbent protection, and there isn't enough competition. Having the government provide the financing will end up being an even stronger incumbent protection, less competition. So how do we get a system where you don't have the candidates going to the special interest for money? We don't have incumbents protected. We have much more competition. The only way that I can see to do it is how we describe it in this book, and that is to say the political parties can finance their own candidates. And I guess most people don't even know that they can't. That's the amazing thing. When the media describes what money is made available to candidates, they say that the Republican Party provides X amount of money to such and such a candidate. Democrats provide Y amount of money to such and such a candidate. But they don't say that almost all of that money that is provided by the Republicans and the Democrats is not coordinated in any way with the candidate. The candidate cannot talk to the party about what kind of polling should be done in the district, what kind of issues should be stressed in that district, whether to go for the women's vote or the men's vote or the worker vote or the nurses vote or whatever it is. The party cannot coordinate those issues with the candidate and what the candidate wants to say, because that's illegal. So almost all of the party's expenditures are uncoordinated with the candidates. Yet the media, when they talk about the support, they lump it all together.
They have to sell newspapers.
They have to sell, and it's also, as we said in the first segment,
they have to sell advertising in the newspapers for the election.
It's also give the newspapers much more power vis-a-vis the public, because it becomes the newspapers and the media generally, who are really the sources that the public has to go to for this information. And so it's in their interest, too, to make it seem as though there's no campaign finance reform that is necessary to make the system work better.
One of the things I like about your theory, but again, works against my theory. My theory, we've talked, is we need a third political party. Mm-hmm. If we go your direction, that helps the third political party, because instead of their individual candidates having to aggregate money and run, the party could raise the money and launch the party.
Yeah.
But the two established parties would figure that out pretty quickly, and I think that would again work against you when you're trying to get these laws passed, because if it is about incumbency protection, then you have the incumbency protection, but you also have the two-party system protection.
Yeah.
So people are not going to want to give up all that control.
Well, I agree. It's going to be very tough, but there isn't a better solution. But I think you're right about third parties. I think third parties would be helped by something like this. But there are institutional elements in our laws that make it very hard for third parties, and for the presidency in particular, I would be worried about a third party candidacy. We can talk this over some other time, but what our current system does, the electoral system that we have with really two major party candidates and the electoral votes, is that it does tend to produce a result where one party has a majority. If we didn't have that system, if we had a whole lot of candidates, a whole lot of parties, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 candidates, we would end up with a lot of special interest candidates. There would be a pro-choice and pro-abortion and pro-immigrant and so forth, and each of them would collect some votes, and in the end the person who's elected president would be elected only with a plurality, and that would not give the president the kind of capital, political capital, that he or she needs to have an agenda and get something adopted by Congress. So I am a little bit concerned about third parties giving them too much power, but I do agree that this system that we're talking about would enable third parties to do much more for their candidates than the current system would.
Well, thank you for your time, and what I would encourage our audience to do is get Peter's book, get another book on the topic, because there's so much about this issue that you really have to understand before you can figure out what the solutions are. And there's such a complex history to it all that you've talked about today, this, layered with the Supreme Court and incumbency protection, all these different acts. I think the person that wants to really get involved in politics owes it to themselves to spend some time again with your book or someone else's book and really know what they're talking about, and then join with your efforts to find some solutions so we can move forward here.
Good. Thank you.
All the best, Peter.
Thank you, Steve.
Always love having a rock star on the show. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed the segment with Peter Wallison. In fact, I hope you enjoyed both segments on campaign finance reform. Perhaps if we're lucky, we'll get Peter back one day to talk about the debt and the restructuring and the causes of the Great Recession. Certainly he's an expert in that arena as well. But I think Peter's interview has done a really good job of educating you on some of the issues and hopefully on some of the solutions. I think that campaign finance reform, again, is an area that everybody's very concerned about, but we haven't been finding many solutions. And in fact, we've been going the wrong way. In my perspective, the Supreme Court and other courts are so tilted toward the free speech aspect of all this that I think we've lost all balance. We've lost all perspective. We've got to find a way to regain that, particularly in light of Citizens United and the Speech Now case. In terms of Peter's presentation, one of the things I really liked about his book is, again, the fact that he's thinking outside the box here. And his approach, I think, is very unusual in comparison to what most people would think are the solution sets. Most people want to limit money and find ways to just take this whole campaign disclosure thing and wrap it up and real tightly and just limit it. I think Peter has an interesting approach, and his partner, they have an interesting approach where they're basically saying, open it up a little more, and as you open it up a little more, that will drive competition. And I think, again, if we have competition and we have that balance, then we will probably not feel that we have this campaign finance problems to the extent, certainly to the extent that we do now. So thank you, Peter. And in thinking about campaign finance reform, I was looking for a link because campaign finance reform is a problem, but it seemed to be unrelated to this dysfunction and polarization we're talking about. It messes up the system, but may not necessarily be a cause, an underlying cause of dysfunction and polarization. So having said that, I was reading an interesting series of articles in the New York Times on one-party rule, and I would suggest to you that if you want to get online and read this series, it's an excellent series, and it drills down and it's starting to examine the causes of one significant one-party rule and then the implications of significant one-party rule. And in one of the recent articles that I had read, there's a link there between the success of campaign finance reform and polarization. Again, one of the ways that polarization presents itself is when one party controls all of the legislature and all of the executive branch in a particular jurisdiction. We talked about that in one of our shows, the ways you can have variations on a theme, but clearly when the executive branch and the legislature is controlled by one party, you have one-party rule, you have implications for polarization that are not positive and usually don't play out well. And I think we've seen a lot of that in some of the decisions that are coming out, particularly at the state level, where they're dominated by one party. So what the New York Times did is they linked the explosion of campaign finance reform, Citizens United, Speech Now, and the use of the not-for-profit status to high disclosure to open up statewide campaigns to the national level. And they walk you through how various states are now attracting money from all over the country and how this money is being funneled through multiple sources, multiple steps, very intricate webs, very intricate patterns of how this money is ending up directed to a particular state. And the goal of this money is to create single rule, single party, single organization, domination, and control of states. The scary part is that right now, this article explains, we are at the high water mark for single party rule, at least for the last 60 years. So in the last 60 years, this is the highest and the most we've had of a single party rule at the state level. And here's the breakdown. Let's look at the board. There are 23 states that are singularly controlled by Republicans. There are 13 states that are singularly controlled by Democrats. And there's only 13 states where we have mixed government. Again, the executive may be different than the legislature, or the two houses of the legislature may be different from each other. Nebraska is an interesting exception because in Nebraska they have a nonpartisan legislature and it's unicameral, so they don't really fit that dynamic. Although my suspicion is Nebraska has been heavily dominated by the Republican Party. But when you have this much single-party domination, we have 36 states now with single-party domination, you get a distortion in legislation and you get a distortion in government. And what we're going to start talking about on our next show is how this distortion then plays out in redistricting and another layer of incumbency protection. So I recommend to you the New York Times series, and I recommend to you to start thinking about the link between campaign finance reform and polarization. Our next guest is Jeff Pele. Jeff is the Director of Research at Ballotpedia. I think most of you know that I'm a big fan of Ballotpedia. I think it's the best internet site for information on politics. What we're going to talk to Jeff about today is a new phenomenon, or a growing phenomenon rather, in politics, where at the time of the general election there is lack of competitiveness, a growing lack of competitiveness. The Republican may be unopposed, the Democrat may be unopposed, and this is becoming an increasing and growing phenomenon. So Jeff has done a lot of research on this topic, and we're going to drill down and see why Jeff thinks this is a problem and what we need to do to solve it. So Jeff, welcome to None of the Above.
Thanks so much for having me today, Steve.
Jeff, before we get started, perhaps you could talk a little bit about what it means to be the Director of Research at Ballotpedia. What are some of the things you do there? What is your day-to-day experience with the site?
Sure. So I've been working for Ballotpedia since June of 2010 now, so almost 4 years. And What the director of research position allows me to do is to, focus on all of the behind-the-scenes research and the little-known facts that voters don't always have readily available for them. So, what does it take to get on the ballot, or what are some original research projects that we can do specifically into, say, competitiveness in elections? And I've had the opportunity to work on a variety of projects at Ballpedia, including state legislatures, redistricting, Congress, state executives. So if you like politics, it's a really exciting position to be in.
So obviously you've done some research and you're noticing, or you've noticed for a while, you've been documenting the fact that we are lacking competitiveness in our general elections.
Yeah, that's right. It's been said that a working democracy requires contested, competitive elections, and in recent years, the trend is toward just less and less competition in elections, despite the increasing amount of money that's spent on the seemingly endless campaign cycle. And this problem is seen at both the congressional and state legislative election levels.
Well, is that part of the problem, that there is this endless spending cycle? And if you would be an opponent to take on an incumbent, you'd say, why do I want to do this? Why do I want to have to raise all this money and take on the incumbent? Is that a part of the problem from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that redistricting can contribute a lot to that, where it's pretty understood which districts are safe for specific candidates. Incumbents regularly win re-election more than 90% of the time. Incumbents run for re-election in more than 80% of the districts. So in a lot of cases, you definitely see that it's already a given. People know who's going to win, and at that point, many people think it's not even worth running in the first place.
Yeah, you mentioned redistricting. We haven't talked about that yet on the show, and it's going to be an important topic for us. But maybe you could explain briefly what redistricting is and how it plays into what you're talking about today.
Sure. So redistricting is the redrawing of census line of the congressional and state legislative district lines, and it takes place every 10 years after the census process. Who controls the redistricting process? It varies from state to state. But most of the time, it's usually the politicians themselves. And critics like to say that the problem with redistricting is that it flips the basic formula of elections. So instead of voters choosing their elected officials, what redistricting allows to happen is the politicians select their constituents. And this phenomenon, it creates gerrymandering, and every cycle it seems to just kind of get worse and worse as the elected officials draw the districts in their favor and kind of breed away competition from elections.
So you mentioned that more than 90% of the time the incumbent wins. Is this true at Congress level, state legislative level, across the board?
This is across the board, Congress and state legislatures. Specifically say, so for example, in Congress, over the past 6 election cycles, more than 90% of all U.S. House races, not only do incumbents win their races 90% of the time, but even of the other races, 90% of all elections were decided by a margin of victory of greater than 5%. So they're not even close, the elections where an incumbent might even lose. It's just a really uncompetitive environment out there right now.
So what are your numbers showing you in terms of competitiveness? How many races are there that you track, and how many of them are in fact not competitive?
Yeah, so let's talk a little about state legislature first. This is something that we pay really close attention to at Ballpedia. It kind of started back in 2010. We were building lists of candidates of all 6,125 seats that were up for election that year. And this was, the year that the Tea Party came into national recognition. There was a lot of rhetoric going around that there was a high degree of competitiveness in elections once again. So as we're building our list of candidates, we kind of noticed that this didn't seem to be the case, at least anecdotally. So we developed a competitiveness index to try and capture this, statistically speaking. Our competitiveness index looked specifically at 3 factors. One is the incumbent running for re-election in a district. With incumbents winning re-election in more than 90% of races, a seat becomes much more likely to become competitive if there's no incumbent on the ballot. The second factor we look at is whether the incumbent is indeed running for re-election, and if so, do they face a primary challenger? The third factor, which will speak more to the competitiveness, is are there 2 major party candidates in the general election? With more than 99% of seats held by 2 major parties, a competitive race would require at least two major party candidates for voters to choose from. And when we looked at the data for 2010 and 2012, we were amazed to find that of the 6,000 seats up for election each year, more than 2,000 seats have only one major party candidate appearing on the ballot. So in effect, 1/3 of all seats in state legislatures, the election is effectively decided before voters even show up to the polls.
That's stunning. Now, is that a recent phenomenon? Has this been developing over the last decade or two? How historical have you been in your attempt to define this problem?
We haven't had a chance to go back too far beyond 2010 yet. We really hope to do that at some point in the years ahead, but it does seem to be a situation that's growing. The competitiveness seems to be on the decline, and especially right after the redistricting process. We saw a 6% increase from 2010 to 2012 in the number of seats that did not have two major party candidates on the ballot. So it does seem to be getting worse.
Now, I would think that people would argue that in redistricting, even if, as you said, the candidates are selecting who they want to represent, that since most of this will be new territory for them, a challenger may say, if I'm ever going to take on an incumbent, I would take on an incumbent at a time when they're trying to introduce themselves to their new district, because I kind of have an equal shot at that. But you're not seeing that happening.
Some of the data in 2012 with Congress specifically saw a little bit of that. In particular, I think with respect to some resignations. So the example that kind of jumps out for me is Barney Frank, where he chose specifically not to run for re-election, and he made no bones about saying that the whole reason was because he didn't want to have to meet new constituents in his district that was redrawn to include something like 200,000 different residents than who he previously had represented. So I think a lot of times what happens is when incumbents see that they might have a more difficult re-election campaign, they just simply choose not to run. Dan Burton in Indiana was another example of this from the last election cycle.
Now, one of the things that I've observed, but I don't have a statistical basis to prove, and I don't know if you have any insight, is this notion that a lot of times, in order to protect the party, whether the Democrat currently holds a seat or the Republican currently holds a seat, the incumbent waits until the very last minute to say whether or not they're going to run again. Now, they've probably let the party know they're not going to run again, but by waiting so long to make that announcement, they may then preclude a challenger for stepping up because the challenger didn't have enough notice, didn't have enough time to start raising money.
Yeah, this is definitely something we've noticed. It seems to take a different shape and form in every state, but in every state we've looked at, there is some semblance of the incumbents controlling essentially the rules of the game. A couple of stories come to mind right away. In Maryland earlier this year, they altered the filing deadline for candidates. Normally it was somewhere along the lines of March or April, and the legislators moved it up to January. The reason for that was because they admitted this, that they wanted to see prior to the session who they might be running against for election, because this would help them shape how they voted during the session on bills. They can now manipulate what they voted on just to make sure that they could protect their incumbency status. In South Carolina in 2012, hundreds of candidates were kicked off the ballot, in part because the political party themselves made the process complicated for non-incumbents, and they had to fill out essentially a second form that the political parties did not help them with. And there were tons of lawsuits, and candidates ultimately, in many cases, had to file as petition candidates just to get on the ballot at all. A third example would be in Idaho. The Republican Party tried to change the rules this past year for primary ballot access. They wanted to institute a change where any candidate would actually require specific approval from the party themselves in order to obtain ballot access. The change didn't actually go through, but these three examples kind of indicate a growing trend where ballot access is just being increasingly restricted for those not connected within the existing major political parties.
It's interesting you mentioned Maryland and the maneuvering of the dates. In Illinois, which is where I'm from, and I maintain most of my political contacts, there's been a horrendous pension problem for years. Illinois was cited as being one of the states that had the deepest pension hole to dig out of, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yep.
And what happened is in November, the General Assembly met in what they call their veto session. And in the veto session, they did not address pensions at all. They didn't touch it. Yet 3 weeks later, the day after the filing deadline, they came back and voted on pension reform. So this goes back to what you were saying. These people who are trying to hang on to their seats want to protect what may be perceived as a vote that is not a good vote for them. So they wait until a time when they take that vote, and they know they've already locked in their job. So I find that to be particularly disingenuous. And to hear you say this is going on, in other parts of the country is it's a sad commentary.
Yeah, and that Illinois story sounds all too familiar for Illinois, and you're very familiar with it, like you said. Illinois has always stood out in my mind because of the paperclip stories, where candidates will be disqualified from the ballot because they either didn't use paperclips on their ballot application forms, or they, in some cases, used paperclips instead of staples. I mean, just the kind of most trivial reasons for removing candidates from the ballot, and it just contributes to the lack of competition in general elections.
So we have ballot access is a problem, we have funding is a problem, redistricting is a problem. How do we start to solve these issues? How can Ballotpedia help in the way they put information out to educate people on how to deal with these issues?
Mm-hmm. Sure. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do to help is just to allow individual citizens, voters, people who might be interested in running to more easily obtain the information that they need to either run for office or just to become educated voters in elections. I'm sure it'll come up much more later on, but with the increasing amount of gerrymandering of the districts and with population migration and just districts in general becoming much more single party controlled, the primary becomes a much more important event, and it's often difficult for voters to even understand that primaries are important with general election turnout as low as it is, and primary election turnout is 10% usually that of a general election. So trying to really just make it much more obvious and more accessible to get information about their elections for both voters and candidates, that'll really help a lot. At least we hope in the long run.
Yeah, one of my concerns, and we weren't supposed to be talking about it today, so I don't spend too much time because we're going to get to it, is this notion that we don't have a high turnout. Do you think part of the reason we don't have a turnout is, let's say the person wakes up on November 8th or whatever it is, this election day, and they say, well, no one's even running against my U.S. Senator, no one's even running against my congressman or woman, I don't want to get out of bed to go vote for the school board today. Do you think some of it is that there's lack of competitiveness at the top of the ballot?
Yeah, I think it definitely would appear to be that way. People are very logical and rational with their uses of time, and especially in this growing internet age, I think there's a lot of fun stuff people can do with their time. They can spend time with their family, they can work, they can read a book, they can go on the internet. And to spend 2, 3, and 4 hours at the polls, first of all, educating yourselves about the candidates and then spending the actual time going to the polls, unless they feel like they're an educated voter or unless they feel like their vote actually makes a difference, there's a good percentage of people that probably they just decide they'd rather just stay away. And that does seem to be, I think, growing a little bit in recent years, and I would definitely agree that's tied in part to the lack of competitiveness. And we do see that in some cases, the closer the margin of victory in an election, usually the higher the turnout, because people realize, my vote might actually make a difference here.
So Jeff, this is great information. For someone who wants to go to Ballotpedia now and find out more about your studies and get some more information about this, in closing, tell them what they need to do and how they can find more background on this topic.
Sure. So you can just visit ballotpedia.org. There's a search bar that you can, search competitiveness index, and you get all of the studies that we've done specifically into state legislative competitiveness. If you click on there's a map on the home page, you can click right into a state and get access into all of our election results pages and our ballot access pages for candidates. On the right side of the home page, there will be a number of links that will, for the various projects that we cover and for ballot access. everything's there. You can kind of get lost within the wiki for hours and hours on end, and hopefully find information to your delight about politics and elections.
Jeff, this has been great. Hopefully sometime this afternoon your site will be flooded with people wanting to know about competitiveness in elections. Thank you for your time.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
Thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's show. We always hope that you are both entertained and educated. Today's show really tied two themes together that we started actually in our last program. We've now done a pretty good job of investigating this whole arena of campaign finance, and thanks to our guest Peter Wallison, I think we've got some potential solution sets on the table. It's a very complicated area. I don't think we'll see solutions overnight, but again, with vigilance and with great ideas and with people trying to push the ball a little, I think we're going to see some results. I also don't know when it's going to happen, but I predict that the Supreme Court at some point is going to have to back off a bit on some of its notions in terms of its decisions. The Citizens United case is very problematic. I find it to be very problematic. And I think as that plays out over the next few years, we're going to find some solution sets at the judicial level as well as the legislative level. I think you will also find that what we've done is tied this notion of campaign finance reform to incumbency protection. And our last guest, Jeff Paley, has shown us how, quite frankly, this is playing out in the field of the general election, where we do not have very many competitive seats anymore. Incumbency protection is a real thing, and it's now playing out in reduced competitive seats. And this leads to polarization. So all these themes tie together at a certain intersection. For those of us that have been with us before, you know that we have a homework assignment on every show. You're not graded, but we certainly hope that you will contact us through the email or the internet or whatever and let us know how you're doing on your homework and if it's making a difference for you. Last homework assignment was to look up who represents you. Who are these people that are elected to solve these problems for you? Whether or not they're solving them, at least who are the voices for you that are pushing their switches on the floor of the legislature? And do you have access to them? Do you know how to contact them? Do you know how to reach out to them? Do you know how to speak to them? So our last homework assignment was to find out who these people are. Now you know who they are. So today's assignment is let's push the envelope a bit. Let's think about how to get in touch with them. There's two ways I suggest you can do that. One way is see if there's an issue that's important to you. We talked a lot about campaign finance. If you found this compelling, if you started to develop some passion about campaign finance reform, go on the web, Google campaign finance reform. I'm sure there's a number of organizations that will show up. Get involved. See what their message is. See where they're going with this and see if they have some solution sets. If they do, hop on board. Become a member. Get on their email list. Find out what they're doing. And then when they go to Congress or they go to the state legislature and they start presenting solutions, they'll alert you to this, and then you can jump in and wear your citizen lobbyist hat. So find an issue that you're passionate about, and let's start moving in a direction that will get you activated on that issue. If you don't have that passion right now, and maybe you're just upset because the system's so dysfunctional, let's make a touch with one of these elected officials. Let's send them an email. Let's call them. I don't think you even have to say anything more than, this is Mark Jones, Susie Smith, and you represent me. I want to stay in touch with you. I want to keep up with you on the issues. This is an election year. Remember, 2014 is not a presidential election year. It's an off year, but there are elections. Your state representative will be up this year. Your state congressman will be up this year. Your federal congressman will be up this year. Perhaps your state senator will be up this year. Your mayor may be up this year. Get in touch with one of them. Just let them know you're out there. Let them know you're watching. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem.